That's it.
Okay. Andrew, can I go get the dust? Okay. Change video. Okay, thanks.
Today was CCTV hours,
And they are recording video. Good morning, class. Let me check if it's attend. There are no any. Okay. Ndema chijeni chawo chinde chikuvuta. Good morning, class. I would like to welcome you all to this class, Vulnerability and Disaster Risk Management. I know a lot of you know me, but I can see there are some new faces. Beatrice Chimbizi, or you can use Mrs. Zumani. Chimbizi is my father's name. I'll be taking you through all this semester with vulnerability. For today, we're going to look at terminologies used in disaster management. So I'll be using this vulnerability and disaster management interchangeably because when looking at vulnerable, if something is vulnerable, that means there is something that happened to make that thing vulnerable. So mostly this vulnerable word is kindly used in disaster. So that's why there's disaster management at the end of the vulnerability. So I'll be using the terms interchangeably. I'm moving through disaster so that I can list all the terminologies that we're going to learn for today. So as we're waiting for the duster, I will just mention some of the terminologies that we are going to learn. One of the terminologies is disaster. So this is one of the terms that we'll be using as we are proceeding with our course. We'll also look at types of these disasters, but not in deep on the types because we're looking at only terminologies. So look at a small scale disaster and a large scale disaster. So these are under the same disaster. Then we look at small scale disaster, large scale disaster. We'll also look at frequent and infrequent disasters. Frequent and infrequent disasters. We'll also discuss what a slow onset disaster is. A slow onset disaster. We'll also look at a sudden onset disaster. Sudden onset disaster. From disaster, we'll also discuss of disaster loss database. What is a disaster loss database? Then we'll look at disaster management. After discussing on disaster management, we'll look at disaster risk. Disaster risk. So there are a lot of terminologies that we'll discuss today. Yes. So only looking at terminologies used These are terminologies used in disaster management. One of the terminology is disaster. Then we look at small scale disaster. Small scale disaster. Large scale disaster. Frequent and infrequent disaster. Frequent and infrequent disaster. We look at a slow onset disaster, a sudden onset disaster. So let's discuss these terminologies. A disaster. When talking of a disaster, this is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community. It is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous events. A serious disruption of a functioning of a community or society due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure. A serious disruption of a functioning of a community or a society due to hazardous events interacting with the conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. So this serious interruption that disturbs a community or society due to its exposure to a certain kind of vulnerability or capacity or a hazardous event, it will lead to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, and environmental loss and impacts. So we are looking at a disaster. Whenever you hear the term disaster, it is something that have caused a serious disruption or a serious damage on a society or just a community. But then this destruction doesn't just come on its own. One of the cause of this serious disruption is because maybe the society or the community is vulnerable to a certain hazardous event. Okay? There's something that has caused this community or society to be vulnerable. I'll use an example of malaria. For you to suffer from malaria, it means maybe you're not using mosquito repellent, you're not sleeping under mosquito nets. That means you have made yourself vulnerable to mosquitoes so that they can bite you. And the end result of this is you suffering from malaria. So for a disaster to occur, there should be conditions that have caused that disaster to occur. Are we together? Yeah. Maybe the society, maybe the houses in that society are not that strong, or maybe they are exposed to strong winds. There are a lot of factors that can cause a society or a community to be vulnerable or to be exposed to a disaster. So this disaster can lead to a lot of damages, okay? One of the damage can be economic damage. It can be human damage because people will be injured. There can be environmental loss. So in terms of environmental loss, we need to think of those aquatic and non-aquatic living organisms. So there will also be a damage because of this disaster. So this effect of disaster can be immediate and localized, but it is often widespread and could last for a long time. So the effects may test or exceed the capacity of a community or society to cope using its own available resources. So for a disaster to be called a disaster, it means it has occurred several times, okay? And you're calling it a disaster. No, that's not a disaster. A disaster, it should be repeated. It should be happen over a long period of time, and then the end result of that serious disruption will end up that maybe the community have failed to cope up with the situation that have come with the disaster using the available local resources. So because the society have failed to cope using the available local resources, they call for emergency, okay? They call for help. That's why we say there is a disaster, because it has lasted for a long period of time. There is damage. The society have failed to to cope with the situation that have come due to this disaster for a long period of time, using the available local resources, and at the end there is a lot of damage, economically, socially, environmentally, and even human beings. There is that impact. So emergence is something that is used interchangeably with the term disaster. As for example, in the context of biological and technological hazard, or we can say health emergency, this emergency can also be used as hazardous. So we use emergency, we use hazardous, we use disaster interchangeably. That's why you say there's an emergency in Nsanje, okay? Because there was serious, heavy rains. So we are calling for a help. So we use emergency, we use hazardous, and we use disaster interchangeably. Okay, so after looking at disaster, we have to discuss small-scale disasters. When talking of a small-scale disaster, it is a type of a disaster that only affects local communities, which requires assistance beyond the affected community. A type of disaster only affecting local communities which require assistance beyond the affected community. So we're talking of a small-scale disaster. It is a type of disaster only affecting local communities which require assistance beyond the affected community. So it is called a small-scale disaster. For example, maybe you can say there was earthquake that have caused a serious destruction in Kisapo, okay? So that destruction is beyond the community's capacity to control. It only affects a small community. That's a small-scale disaster. People in that community are failing to cope up or to come up with measures to control the effects of this kind of a disaster that have affected their community. So they call for emergency, they call for help from other external sources. Have I made myself clear on small-scale disasters? Or I can use this area 15. So let's say, for example, there's floods and a lot of houses have collapsed in area 15, and people in area 15 are failing to cope up or to come up with measures to deal with this impact of this kind of serious interruption or disruption. So you're calling for help from other sources. That's a small scale disaster. So when talking of a large scale disaster, that's the opposite of a small scale disaster. It affects a large area, but then this time around we need help from the nation or international assistance. That's a large scale. So these large scales you see in BBC, other televisions asking for help from other international assistance or national assistance. That's a large scale disaster. I will use an example from Nsanje. Nsanje is one of the districts that is most affected with disasters. So they call for a help nationally, sometimes internationally. That's a large scale disaster. We have frequent and infrequent disasters. Frequent and infrequent disasters. So these disasters, they depend on the probability of occurrence and the return period of a given hazard and its impact.
Too fast.
Frequent and infrequent disasters. These disasters depends on the probability of occurrence and the return period. They depend on the probability of occurrence and the return period of a given hazard and its impact. They depend on the probability of occurrence and the return period of a given hazard and its impacts. The impact of frequent disasters could be cumulative. The impact of frequent disasters could be cumulative or become chronic for a community or society. So we're looking at the frequent and the occurrence of these disasters. Some disasters occur frequently, others are infrequent. But then what matters is the return period of the given hazard and its impact. So let's say, for example, this year area 15 is affected with disasters. Next year the same area is affected with disasters. So for you to return or to rebuild whatever you lost last year due to a certain kind of disaster, it would be hard because you also be affected with the same disaster the following year. So it will depend on the frequency of the disaster occurrence. And some disasters, they occur infrequently. It may take maybe several years for a certain community to be affected with a disaster. And then for you to retain whatever you lost due to a certain disaster, it will be easy. Because maybe, for example, let's say an area was affected with disaster maybe 5 years ago. Within 5 years, people will be able to recover whatever they lost during that disaster. But then, let's take an area whereby there is frequent disasters. I'll keep on using Nsanje because it's where disasters are more likely to occur. People in that area, they find it hard to repair whatever they lost due to a certain kind of disaster. So that's how we're talking about the frequent and infrequent disasters. Maybe you have questions before I proceed. Okay, well, I'm proceeding with a slow onset disaster. A slow onset disaster. So it is defined as a disaster that emerges gradually over time. It is a disaster that emerges gradually over time. So examples of slow onset disasters could be droughts. They emerge over a period of time. Slow onset disasters. There is desertification as an example of slow onset disaster. Desertification. There is epidemic diseases. Slow onset disaster. They emerge gradually over a period of time. Okay? We're talking of desertification. You hear people telling, or maybe in radios pronouncing that you're not supposed to cut down trees, okay? But people are cutting down trees. So after some period, we'll suffer from desertification because all trees will be gone. Let's look at floods, okay? Here in upper areas, not the lower here. We are receiving floods just because maybe we didn't listen to people who are telling us not to cut down trees, not to cultivate along the river banks. So we are receiving these floods because of our delays, but these floods are coming in after a long period of time. So it takes time for that disaster to occur. Maybe there are some delays. There are conditions that causes these slow onset disasters. Droughts. What causes droughts? So because you're not following the precautions and procedures to prevent droughts, the end result will be that drought will affect us and will leave an impact in our communities. That's a slow onset disasters. And then we have a sudden onset disaster. This one is the one triggered by a hazardous event. It is triggered by a hazardous event that emerges quickly or unexpectedly. It is triggered by an event that emerges quickly or unexpectedly. An example of this disaster can be chemical explosion. Chemical explosion. It happens unexpectedly, but will leave an impact. Okay? We can talk of transport accidents. You don't prepare that today I'm going to have an accident. It just happened quickly and unexpectedly. That's also a disaster. We can talk of earthquake. You don't plan, it doesn't take time, it just happens suddenly and unexpectedly. Another example can be volcanic eruption. You don't know that you're going to have volcanic eruption. Just happen unexpectedly and it will leave an impact on the people around that area. So that's a sudden onset disaster. I'm proceeding with the terminologies used in vulnerability and disaster risk management. Another terminology is disaster loss database. Disaster loss database. This disaster loss database is a set of systematically collected records about disaster occurrence. It is a set of systematically collected records about disaster occurrence, damages, loss, and impacts. A set of systematically collected records about disaster occurrence, damages, losses, and impacts. Ideally, compliant with the framework of monitoring disasters. So there's a framework that monitors disasters, the occurrence of disasters, but then you need to keep records of disasters. So in that records, whereby you keep the information about disasters, you keep about disaster occurrence. On disaster occurrence, you record when was the disaster, where, how did it happen. So you keep those information. You also keep about the damages. What is it that this disaster has damaged? What about the losses? When talking of the losses, think of those business people. They lose a lot of things. There is also loss of lives. So you record all those things. And the impacts. The impacts are the damages. Maybe the house is collapsed. Okay? Those are the impacts of a disaster. So you keep all those information in a system for future reference or for monitoring disasters. And then we have disaster management. That's another terminology. Disaster management. This is the organization planning and application of measures. Disaster management is the organization, planning and application of measures, preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. Organization, planning, and application of measures. These measures are there to prepare for, respond to, and recovery from a disaster. So there are three technical words in disaster management: preparing for, responding, and recovery. So these are the three technical words in disaster management: prepare, respond, and recover. So you organize, okay? You sit together, okay? There is a disaster. You plan before, not after, okay? You as disaster management officers, you need to plan before a disaster occurs. Okay, it looks like next year we are going to have floods. So you sit together, you organize yourselves. After sitting together, you plan, what should we do in preparing for, okay? What should we do? Okay, in preparing for this disaster, we need to come up with a lot of boats so that we should be able to rescue people. Or we should ask people to evacuate to a safer place faster before the disaster occurs, okay? That means you're preparing for, okay? After preparing, let's say for example you prepared last year and whenever you are receiving rains and then there is floods, you respond now to the event. Responding, you use those measures, those techniques, those plans you had in preparing for this disaster. You're responding. You're going there to rescue people, okay? You're going there to provide warfare to those people who are affected with disasters. In this responding, you respond during the occurring of the disaster. So you respond during the occurrence of the disaster. And then the last technical word is recovery. After responding, okay, you have transferred people, have evacuated people to a safer place, okay? Those people, they need to recover physically, psychologically, and socially. You need to help them to recover. So that's where you come up with the counselings, because people may lose their relatives, their friends, their wealth. Maybe maybe they have injured, they are hospitalized. There are a lot of things. Those they are traumatized, I can say. So you just need to provide them with counseling in recovery. There's counseling. There is provision of welfare services. You proceed giving them welfare services until they settle down in their new environment. You build houses for them, okay? You write proposals, maybe asking for help for them so that they should live as normal beings. That's on recovery. So that's about disaster management. Then we have emergency management. It is also another term that we'll be discussing. This emergency management, it is used interchangeably, sometimes with disaster management. But there's a difference between emergency management and disaster management. Emergency can also relate to hazardous events. Remember, I've talked of hazardous, emergency, and disaster, okay? So emergency can also be related to hazardous event, but emergency does not result in a serious disruption of a functioning of a community. That's the difference between a disaster management and emergency management. You can use them interchangeably, but there is a difference. We're talking of emergency management. Yes, it is a disruption of a community, okay? But then its end result, it's not that serious, okay? It does not cause a serious disruption of a community. Okay, kanitsinje ke nanga kakokoloka, kanitsinje ka 24 kapita. It's a damage, yes, but does that have an impact on the lives of people in that community? No, that's a emergency management. So you go and reconstruct that bridge, because people use that bridge maybe for transportation. So you're responding to a certain emergency. Are we together? It is okay. Emergency, disaster, and hazardous event. Okay, we are using them interchangeably, but we're not talking of disaster management. We are looking at a serious disruption of the functioning of a community. Maybe there is floods. That flood has affected the lives of people. There is a lot of damages. Okay, you need to repress. You need to repair. You need to. There is 3 technical words in disaster management: responding to, recovery. There is also, I said there are 3 technical words. Repairing. So that's in disaster management. It's a serious damage that is caused by a certain disaster event or a certain dangerous event. We're talking of emergency management, okay? It's a disaster, yes, but then its impact is not that serious. It does not cause any serious disruption of a functioning of a community. You know, for a community to be a community, it's supposed to be functioning. People are supposed to go to work, to come. Okay, there are a lot of things in a community that happens. But then, if a community stops functioning, that means there's something serious, okay? But then, this emergency management, there's a disaster. I gave an example of, okay, we can talk of a car accident. That one is a disaster too. But then, that car accident doesn't stop a community from functioning. Tikumvana. Anthu ababe kuntchito, okay? Mabanja awo anthu amakhala limodzi. There is that family relation. Community doesn't lose anything. They keep on functioning the way it is. That's emergency. But then you need to respond, okay? You need to respond to this accident because it's an emergency. That's emergency management. Have I made myself clear? Pardon? Flood is not an emergency. That's a disaster. But then it will depend, because we have talked of a large scale, we have talked of a slow onset, okay? Because other floods, they just come frequently and unexpectedly. So you need to respond. It's an emergency because it will affect the functioning of the community. People cannot work. Let's say maybe window. Are you going to learn? No. That means there is a disruption of a functioning of something. While we're talking of emergency, I gave an example of bridge Yaduka, okay? And they will find a different alternative to go to their work, a different route, because it's an emergency you need to respond to, okay? You need to find measures. Bridge Richa, you have responded to an emergency. Caravana. It is called an emergency because it doesn't disrupt any functioning of a community. But you need to respond. Have I answered your question, Andrew? Okay. That's an emergency management. Then we're looking at disaster risk. Disaster risk. When we're talking of disaster risk, it is the potential loss of life, injury, potential loss of life, injury, destroyed or damaged assets, destroyed or damaged assets, which could occur to a system, society, or a community. A potential loss of life, injury, destroyed or damaged assets, which could occur to a system, to a community, in a specific period of time. In a specific period of time, determined probabilistically as a function of hazard. Determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. The potential loss of life, destroyed or damaged assets, which could occur to a system, so in terms of disaster risk, if there's a term risk, that means there is loss of life, there is injury, there is damage of assets, but then there is this probability that these things has happened maybe because that community or that society is exposed to a certain hazardous event, or maybe this community is vulnerable. So we'll be using the term exposed and vulnerable interchangeably, because for a disaster to occur and reaching a point of damaging assets, people losing lives, people getting injured, that means there is this probability that maybe this community is exposed to a certain event, or maybe it is vulnerable to a certain event. Let's say we're talking of floods, okay? Most likely those people who are affected by floods is because they are living in lower areas, whereby they are vulnerable to that flood. They have exposed themselves to that kind of disasters, okay? So the impact of that will be death, loss of lives, injury. So we're talking of a disaster risk. That's a risk, okay? Because people have lost their lives. There is this damage of assets. That's what we're calling a disaster risk. But then it doesn't occur on its own. There should be conditions, probable conditions. That means maybe this person was exposed to a certain hazard or risk. If you drink and drive, you're exposing yourself to accidents, okay? There's this probability that you involve yourself in accidents. The same with disasters. There are conditions that come in because you have exposed yourself to a certain hazard. If you expose yourself to that hazard, you become vulnerable, okay? An example, use another example. I remember in your class, we talked of this theory of Karl Marx, whereby we are looking at some other things that are important in a society, okay? Where we talked of these Alatwainda Mazulu way. We criticize them, yes, but why are they existing? Prostitution have been here for over a long period of time, okay? That means they're important in a society. But then let's look at the risk factors of being a prostitute. You expose yourself to a lot of people, thereby you make yourself vulnerable to catch any kind of diseases. The same with a community that is exposed to a hazardous event. It is vulnerable to any kind of disaster that may come. And then the end result will have those death, injuries, and damaged property. Those are the risks of disasters. That's disaster risk. Disaster risk. It is the potential loss of life, injury, destroyed or damaged assets, which could occur to a system, society, or a community in a specific period of time, determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. That's disaster risk. Another terminology is disaster risk governance. Disaster risk governance. This is a system of institutions. A system of institutions, mechanisms, a system of institutions, mechanisms, policy, and legal frameworks. A system of institutions, mechanisms, policy, and legal frameworks, and other arrangements to guide coordinate, and oversee disaster risk reduction. It is a system of institutions, mechanisms, policy, and legal frameworks and other arrangements to guide, coordinate, and oversee disaster risk reduction and related areas of policy. To oversee disaster risk reduction and related policy. So, disaster risk governance is a collection of institutions, okay? We can talk of mechanisms or the policies that are there to oversee or to control the occurrence of a disaster. So we call them a disaster risk governance, or the policies that are there to control the risk of disasters or to oversee their mechanisms, to oversee that, oh, we are going to have disasters, okay? What should we do? Let's come up with policies so that these people can fall. Everyone should evacuate, okay? Ambezeka zote muna kulengeza ena. Aliyese nyumba yake afolele ndizolimba. They should roof their houses with strong iron sheets, okay? Or maybe you need to build your houses, I don't know what they call it. You need to make drains. Kuti masasa do somewhere. They oversee that maybe you're going to have floods. So those policies, they are there to control these kind of disasters that they are expect to come. So they are governance, disaster risk governance. All the institutions, at disaster management, disaster department, or say we're including them in this disaster governance. But then, a good governance need to be transparent and inclusive. You also need to include the community members when you're making policies, because disasters occurs in communities. So those people, they know better what triggers any kind of disaster in their community. So you need to be transparent. You need to include them when you're making policies in disaster management. And we look at disaster risk management as another terminology. Disaster risk management. Disaster risk management, it is the application of disaster risk reduction policies. The application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies. The application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new risks, to reduce existing disaster risks, and manage residual risks, contributing to the strengthening of resilience. Disaster risk management is the application disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new risks, reduce existing disasters, and manage residual risks, contributing to the strengthening of resilience, and reduction of disaster losses. Contributing to the strengthening of disaster resilience and reduction of disaster losses. So in disaster risk management, you apply those policies that you said in disaster governance. You apply those disaster reduction policies and strategies so that you should be able to prevent disasters, respond to these disasters so that you prevent the occurrence of these disasters and to strengthen resistance to any kind of disaster. That's disaster risk management. Do you have questions? So this is what I had for today. I'll revise whatever we've discussed. We started with defining what a disaster is, whereby I said that it is a serious disruption of a functioning of a community, whereby the community itself, they fail to cope using the locally available resources. That's a disaster. We also discussed about small-scale disasters. These disasters, they occur in a small community, whereby that community fails to cope using its available resources to the damages that this disaster caused. So they call for help from other sources. And then there's a large-scale disaster. This disaster affects a large area, whereby the area, they fail to cope using the available resources. So you invoke the nation and other international organizations to help with some measures. And then we talked of frequent and infrequent disasters. This depends on the probability of the occurrence of a disaster, whereby I said that some disasters, they occur frequently, others infrequently. So the responding to the recovery of this kind of disasters will differ, because if that disaster occurs frequently, that means it will take time for a community to recover. But if it's infrequent, maybe a disaster occurs after 5 years or 10 years, people will be able to recover whatever they lost from any kind of disaster. I talked of a sudden onset disaster, whereby they happen unexpectedly and quickly. An example of this, I cover an example of road accident. You don't prepare, they just happen quickly and unexpectedly. And you can also include floods, flash floods in these sudden onset disasters. That's another example. We discussed of disaster loss database, which is a system where you need to give information about the occurrence of the disaster, the impact, and also you need to include losses of a certain impact of a disaster. We talked of emergency management, whereby I said that emergency we use interchangeably with disaster and hazardous event, but then an emergency is something that is not serious because it doesn't affect the functioning of a community. That's an emergency management. We talked of disaster management, the organizing, planning, and application of measures to control, to respond, and to recover from a disaster. Talked of disaster risk, which are the effects of a disaster, whereby there is loss of life, there is injury, there is damage of property. But then this doesn't just come on its own. Maybe the community is vulnerable to a certain kind of disaster. It is exposed to a certain kind of a disaster. Talked of emergency management. We talked of disaster risk governance, an institution, a group of institutions, policies that are put in place to prevent the occurrence or to reduce the occurrence of these disasters. And lastly, looked at disaster risk management, the application of those policies to reduce the impact of disasters. So this is what I prepared for today. Maybe you have questions or something to add on today's classes. Alright, can you come and help me because there's a video. This mouse is not moving. We need to pause the video. I said I should use this arrow keys. I don't know.
Okay. This video?
So you need to pause it.
Or should I just remove it?
No, you don't have to remove. Just pause. They're supposed to save and upload.
Okay. Should I pause it or should it just be over?
Pardon?
Should I pause it or should it just be over?